Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give everybody some time to join and get situated, and we will get started in just a few minutes. Hello, and welcome to our webinar, How to Leverage ISO, NIST, and HITRUST Frameworks. My name is Matt Fullerton, and I'm an account manager here at Tevora. Our presenter today is Mr. John Huckabee, Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance. John, why don't you take us away?
All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. Let's just jump right into it. Here's our agenda. We're going to do a brief introduction to Tevora and myself. Then we're going to give a brief overview of HITRUST, NIST, and ISO 27001. Then we'll talk a little bit more about leveraging the frameworks, keys to successful certifications, and Tevora's value proposition. So we've got a lot of goodies. Let's go ahead and get started. Tevora is an originally approved HITRUST CSS assessor. That means we were one of the first in the game in terms of performing HITRUST certifications. We're also an ISO lead auditor firm. So we have ISO lead auditor practice that really helps organizations become ISO certified. We're also an experienced NIST assessor and implementer. So of course, we're very well prepared to talk to you about how each of these frameworks commingle and what their setting is in the marketplace. Myself, I'm as was previously mentioned, I'm the managing director of our information security and compliance practice, and I have about 17 years of experience. Let's go ahead and just jump right into a HITRUST overview. One of the distinguishing characteristics of HITRUST is that it's a comprehensive security framework. That means that it covers quite a few, if not all, of the primary topics in the security and privacy space. HITRUST calls them domains. There's 19 domains in the HITRUST framework, and they cover everything from business continuity planning and disaster recovery to access control. It's very comprehensive. That's how I always describe HITRUST. One interesting aspect of HITRUST is that it leverages other frameworks for its controls or requirements. So HITRUST does not have any, proprietary controls or control language. It actually leverages controls from other standards such as NIST and ISO 27001, 27002. So that's a key a distinguishing factor of HITRUST that I wanted to really emphasize in this presentation. HITRUST actually leverages other standards. A couple of others, PCI data security standard, for example, it'll leverage some of those requirements as well. HITRUST also gives you the ability to add additional known frameworks to its standard. So for example, you can add the PCI data security standard on top of your HITRUST framework, or you can add the MAR-Z framework, to name a healthcare specific one, on top of your framework. And that's something we've done pretty commonly for organizations. So a pretty unique and interesting attribute of HITRUST. HITRUST is the only universally recognized healthcare information security certification. There really is no other one, certainly in North America, that's universally recognized. So that really is how HITRUST gained prominence in the marketplace. HITRUST has historically been concentrated in the healthcare vertical, but it's been branching out to tackle other verticals. So it wouldn't be surprising to really see it gain steam in some of the other verticals out there. Another interesting attribute of HITRUST, and again, how it relates to NIST, is that HITRUST will actually issue a NIST cybersecurity certificate with your HITRUST certification. And it's the only known third-party NIST certification in the marketplace. So that's a pretty cool feature of HITRUST that I think is worth mentioning. And again, re-emphasizes the overlap that that the two frameworks have, or that some of these frameworks have. And the last point I wanted to point out about HITRUST is that when I say comprehensive, that also means there are a lot of requirements. So on average, our HITRUST certifications have over 300 controls of requirements. Some of our HITRUST environments have as many as 600 controls and requirements. So when I say comprehensive, just know that it's covering a lot of areas, and there are a lot of specific controls that you're going to be tackling when you take on the HITRUST certification journey. So that's really the HITRUST overview. One thing I did want to mention before we continue is that we'll be fielding questions or taking questions throughout the presentation. We won't answer them during the presentation, but we'll answer them near the end of the presentation. So go ahead and feel free to use the GoToWebinar functionality that allows you to submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about our HITRUST methodology. If you're not new to auditing and control testing, or if you're, then this will not be new to you. So, but typically we'll perform a gap assessment for our HITRUST clients. Those typically take about a month from beginning to end. Then we really get in the remediation phase, and that's, in my opinion, where Tevora really differentiates itself from the competition. We really help our clients address their gaps with policy support, procedure support, implementing security tools, you name it. Tevora is an end-to-end security service provider, and we, in my opinion, do one of the best jobs, if not the best job in the marketplace in helping clients remediate their gaps. So that's a very critical phase. It typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 months. So, be prepared to roll up your sleeves to address those gaps. And then the last step is the validated assessment. That's what HITRUST calls the certification audit. So that process has a lot of very prescriptive and mechanical steps, and end to end, that last step, or the validated assessment, takes about 3 months. So all in, you're looking probably about 9 to 12 months to be certified. So it's a process that we've honed over the years. We've been able to certify 100% of our clients. We're pretty proud of that fact. Another fact we're pretty proud of is we've never lost a HITRUST client. So we have 100% client retention in the HITRUST space, which is pretty much unheard of. So we're very proud of both of those facts. So that's a little bit about the HITRUST methodology. Let's talk a little bit about NIST. And then again, at the end, we're going to talk a little bit more about, how to leverage multiple frameworks and how that works. But I wanted to really knock out each of the individual frameworks we're discussing in this presentation so that everybody has a baseline understanding of what they are. NIST is a non-regulatory federal agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce. There are several NIST frameworks that are commonly leveraged in the marketplace, but just know that, again, non-regulatory federal agency. So there's no certification associated with NIST, and it's really kind of just the standard that the government puts out to really help industry secure its environments and to better understand cybersecurity. And the standards are publicly available. So just a terrific standard and framework that's widely adopted and recognized, publicly available. And as a cybersecurity consultant for the last 20 years or so, I can tell you that we've been very grateful that the government has done this for us, because it really has provided kind of a Bible of controls, if you will, not just for security consultants, but for several of these standards like HITRUST to really lean on as a baseline for controls. So let's talk about, for purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about 3 of the standards that NIST puts out, but keep in mind that there are several more. We could talk for an entire day about all of the NIST standards out there, but we're really going to just highlight the 3 that we see in the marketplace as consultants that we work with our clients quite a bit on implementing or utilizing. So the first one of those 3 is 830. It's the Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments. And it's really become the go-to standard for risk assessments. Even the OCR and the healthcare space has formally recognized 830 as an adequate risk assessment methodology. So, when you think of NIST, one of the first standards you should take a look at and try to understand is the Risk Assessment Guide 830. Again, that's leveraged or can be leveraged for both ISO 27001, and we'll get into the risk assessment requirement for ISO 27001, but it can be leveraged for ISO 27001. The NIST 830 framework can also be leveraged for, of course, HITRUST. So it plays very well and overlaps very well with both ISO 27001 and HITRUST. Next is 853, the Security and Privacy Controls for Systems and Organizations. And this is really what I meant by, the Bible of information systems controls, and has been widely adopted and leveraged by organizations like HITRUST to lean on the controls that NIST has put out. Think of this as just basically kind of a control standard document, a security and privacy control standard. So if you're looking for a series of controls to improve or your security posture at your company, this is a great place to start if you're looking for a list of controls and understanding what those controls are. So, that's really, how your company can leverage 853. But then again, know that there's heavy overlap between 853 and other frameworks such as HITRUST. The next is the NIST CSF, and this is actually the newest. This has been out since 2014, I believe it was published, which makes it relatively new, actually. And it's the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Think of this standard and guidance really as a maturity assessment for a company's cybersecurity posture. So if you want to understand where your organization's maturity is at with respect to cybersecurity specifically, this standard we see widely adopted across multiple verticals as organizations look to understand where they're at from a cybersecurity perspective. We work with a lot of organizations with the NIST CSF. Certainly there are other models out there, but in terms of NIST, this is one of the more popular standards and more utilized standards in the NIST library, if you will. And then lastly, I may have mentioned this already, but NIST is vertical agnostic. So we see it adopted in the marketplace by healthcare organizations, financial organizations, again, manufacturing organizations, you name the vertical, NIST is applicable to that vertical. So it's really vertical agnostic and, again, just widely recognized and respected. So that's the NIST overview. Again, it's the same sort of methodology when we work with organizations to help implement or assess against those NIST standards. We'll perform a gap assessment, a remediation, and then attestation. This process is a little more streamlined. There aren't prescriptive steps. There's no third-party certification associated with it. So we can get through this in as fast as 4 months with organizations. But again, remember, it doesn't result with the certification. So if you want to demonstrate a certification to a third party, NIST may not be the methodology for you. We'll get into that a little bit later, but NIST, again, great framework for you to leverage to improve your company's security posture. Let's go ahead and dive into ISO 27001. It's the most widely recognized international information security certification and standard, and really one of the earliest. And a lot of folks don't realize this, but Europe was really in the forefront in terms of security from an information systems perspective, and ISO is one of the outcomes of kind of being a leader in the global space. And really kind of took root in the 90s. So when we're thinking of information security and privacy, you know, the 90s is kind of almost like the caveman years. But ISO was a little bit ahead of the game, and as a result, it's been, in my opinion, the most widely recognized of the standards from a global perspective. As a result of that, it's heavily leveraged by organizations that are doing business internationally. So you don't see a lot of small organizations that do business regionally seeking ISO 27001 certs. And there are some exceptions to that, actually. You'll see individual data centers, for example, ISO 27001 certified, and some technology service providers. But in terms of companies, small non-technology companies, you don't see a lot of individual ISO 27001 certs out there compared to the marketplace and standards. There certainly are a lot of certs out there, but relative to the other certifications, it would be smaller. But when you start talking about larger organizations or even medium-sized or smaller organizations with an international footprint, then you start really getting into the wheelhouse of ISO 27001, since it's been globally recognized and accepted, if you will. A little bit about the specifics of ISO 27001. The certification is, the full recertification is every 3 years. And so that cycle is pretty distinct and unique to ISO. Each of those years, you're required to perform a formal risk assessment and an internal audit. So remember, we mentioned NIST 830 and that risk assessment standard. You can leverage NIST standard as your ISO risk assessment. ISO also has a risk assessment defined in a standard for risk assessments as well, but you're able to leverage either one of those as your ISO risk assessment. ISO also requires an informal internal audit to address what ISO calls conformities and non-conformities as it relates to the ISO information security management system. So year 1, year 2, and year 3 of the ISO life cycle, you'll be performing a risk assessment and an internal audit. You'll also have a surveillance audit years 2 and 3 by a third party, as well, in addition to the first year audit, which is the certification audit, by a third party. So there's a lot of oversight associated with the ISO 27001 framework. And again, with the risk assessment internal audit requirement, that's unique to ISO 27001. There are some very prescriptive steps that must be taken every year to meet the ISO 27001 standard. I wanted to touch a little bit on this concept of the ISMS in ISO 27001. It's pretty unique to, in terms of the frameworks out there. This concept of the ISMS is pretty unique to ISO 27001. And it's really it's described as a security management system, but I describe it to our clients as really a series of processes that are documented to ensure that your organization is following information security processes and best practices. So, think of it as a series of best practices, not just controls, but processes and oversight of those processes to ensure that the environment is being secured. That is a kind of a key distinguishing, attribute of ISO 27001 versus some of the other standards that I wanted to point out. Now, ISO 27001 does have a series of controls that are associated with it. They call it Annex A in the 27001 world, and of course, ISO 27002 provides some additional clarity on what those controls should look and feel like. So there are controls associated by ISO 27001, but I wanted to just really emphasize this concept of the ISMS and the Information Security Management System as kind of a series of security and control processes that should be followed to secure environments. Again, very unique to ISO 27001. Let's go ahead and talk about Tevora's ISO 27001 approach. You can see it's a little bit, there are a couple of other steps when compared to perhaps some of the other compliance standards. We perform a gap assessment as previously described. We help our clients with the remediation of those gaps. And then remember, I called out the internal audit and risk assessment were specifically called out by the standard. So we will perform internal audits and risk assessments on behalf of those organizations. But organizations can take the risk assessment on internally. They don't need a third party such as Tevora to perform that. But again, organizations ask us to do that for them all the time so that it's performed with objectivity and with precision. The internal audit, that needs to be performed by an ISO lead auditor. So just know that if you don't have someone in-house that's not an ISO lead auditor and has been through that training, then you'll need to have a third party such as Tevora perform that internal audit. And we do that for, I would say, about 90% of our ISO clients. We perform the internal audit and the risk assessment for. It's just, we do it pretty cost effectively and with precision that organizations frankly appreciate. And then there's the certification audit step, of course, similar to HITRUST and other third-party certs. There are a series of steps that need to be taken to achieve certification in the ISO space. So that's just kind of a brief overview of the ISO 27001 approach. Let's go ahead and talk about a little bit more. So now that we've covered each of the three, we've covered HITRUST, we've covered NIST and ISO 27001 at a high level. I really wanted to take a step back and talk about, again, how they overlap, where your organization might leverage those, what we're seeing in the marketplace. I wanted to share that experience and knowledge with everyone on the webinar. The first is when and how to leverage ISO 27001. So I just wanted to reemphasize here, again, if you have an international footprint, or if you're looking for an agnostic certification, a vertical agnostic certification, and a framework that talks about managing your security environment, it's not just a list of controls. ISO 27001 might be the cert that you're looking for. You know, as with any compliance certification, a lot of your business partners may steer you one way or the other. So just know that if you're doing business with other organizations that are savvy about security and compliance, they may ask you for an ISO 27001 cert. A lot of our clients, that's how they stumbled across ISO 27001. Their business partners ask them to do that. Again, it's a pretty broad spectrum. We see small organizations, medium and large organizations, but we do see a lot of the work in kind of these international organizations or technology organizations leverage it quite a bit. There's, I would say, a disproportionate amount of those types of organizations that are leveraging ISO 27001. But certainly before deciding on a standard, you're going to want to consult with a consultancy like Tevora to help guide you to what the right framework or standard is for you. A little bit about HITRUST. Again, a lot of emphasis in the healthcare vertical. HITRUST is branching out from being healthcare specific, but I would say about 90% of the HITRUST certifications we see are business associates or covered entities, to use some healthcare specific language, in the healthcare vertical. Well, certainly you may not be a healthcare organization. You may just like the comprehensive nature of HITRUST and some of the third-party assurance associated with HITRUST. So if you're not a healthcare organization, you may still consider the HITRUST certification. But again, thus far, I would say the vast amount of certifications that we see are in the healthcare space. And then lastly, the NIST standards. Again, if you don't really need a third-party certification and you're just looking for a framework that your company can leverage that's relatively cheap and basically free, this may be the NIST standards may be the standards for you. And I highlighted 830 as the risk assessment standard that's almost universally recognized as and become kind of the go-to standard for risk assessments. Of course, 853, which is kind of that Bible of controls that I spoke to. And then, of course, the cybersecurity framework, which is really a maturity assessment of your organization's cybersecurity posture. Really, this is a great way to work on things in-house or internally. Not as great in terms of demonstrating compliance to third parties, but if you're not concerned with that, then this is a great way to go. And it's really a great starter place for newer organizations as well. We'll say organizations say, we don't want to spend the time and resources for some of these third-party certifications such as HITRUST or ISO. We just want something that we can dive into right away, cost-effectively, that's pretty clear and articulate and transparent. We see a lot of organizations start down that path, the cybersecurity path or the security controls path with NIST. So, that's what we're seeing in the marketplace. Now, in terms of how these frameworks overlap, a lot of organizations will come to us. I just spoke to one of the leading technology companies in the world last week, and some of their business units are required to be compliant with as many as 15 frameworks or standards or federal laws, if you will, or international law. So you really want to think about, okay, maybe just one of these standards isn't sufficient. What we commonly run into in the marketplace is organizations, particularly larger companies or companies that are vertical agnostic, such as technology companies that, they're doing business in multiple verticals. They may need to be compliant or certified in multiple frameworks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how that works. And Tevora has a unified audit approach that really talks about addressing multiple frameworks simultaneously. So, the question slide, hold on just a second here. Okay. So this is the slide I wanted to go to. Here's the unified audit approach and deliverables. And really, it's not a simple approach. This takes skilled consultants and folks with several years of experience in not only compliance, but in security to do this effectively. And it's really upfront in these first two phases, the strategy phase and the control alignment phase, where it takes experience. So when we're talking about a unified approach to back up, we're talking about combining multiple frameworks. Maybe you're combining HITRUST with ISO and NIST, all three of them together. We run into this quite a bit. So Tevora, over the years, has developed a framework and strategy for addressing that exact problem. Organizations often run into what we call audit fatigue, where if they're required to be compliant with 15, standards or frameworks or regulations, they're getting audited 15 separate times throughout the year. That doesn't work for most organizations for obvious reasons. So what the unified audit approach does is it combines them and it aligns them so that you can achieve compliance with multiple standards, but only have to go through the process once, if you will. So this first arrow represents strategy. So that's basically understanding who are the key stakeholders, what business units are involved, what is the scope for each of the standards, what standards should we be considering and looking at, and then getting buy-in with that compliance and security strategy. Again, that's going to take some executive involvement, not only from the consultant side, but also from your organization, internally within your organizations, from key stakeholders such as the CIO, the Chief Information Security Officer, et cetera, maybe even the board of directors in some instances that have a vested interest in security and compliance, which most do these days. That strategy phase can take as long as a month to 3 months. It just really depends on how motivated your organization is in terms of, getting to a strategy and then executing on it. The next is control alignment. So you may have noticed that all of these standards that I've spoke to today, they all have controls associated with them or requirements. Aligning requirements among multiple frameworks, takes some time, and controls don't necessarily map directly. So what antivirus controls look like in HITRUST, for example, may be very different than what antivirus controls look like in ISO or NIST. So mapping and aligning those requirements and understanding where the nuances are can take a little bit of time, but it's certainly a key step. I would say that takes, depending on the number of frameworks, anywhere from a week to 4 weeks, but certainly it's a critical step in aligning those controls. Next, we perform the gap assessment. So once we've established the controls, the universal controls, we apply those to the scopes where they need, or to the environments where they need to be applied, and we ascertain what your gaps are previously to the other, similar to the other methodologies that I described that were framework specific. We perform, of course, the same gap assessment. Then we'll go into remediation, and then you go into the reporting phase. Now, again, when you're dealing with multiple frameworks, it can get a little bit complex. So I'm kind of hovering over some of the complexities, such as timelines, such as some of the critical steps in terms of reporting. It's very different from one certification to the next. So just know that there's a lot of detail. This is kind of a high-level gloss over of the process, but there's a lot of detail underneath that needs to be achieved when performing a unified audit. Next, I just wanted to quickly just talk about Tevora and why I believe we're the premier security and compliance consultancy globally. Policy templates, we have those for all of the frameworks. We have hands-on executive oversight, strategic remediation. What I mean by that is getting executives involved, not only from our consultancy, so getting managing directors involved in that strategy, but also key stakeholders in organizations. We provide executive summaries, so we're very well versed, and we understand the importance of effectively communicating to leadership what the strategy should be and what the importance of security and compliance is to their organization. I believe Tevora does that very well, and it's a differentiator for us. We're also a solution provider. Most consultancies that have dedicated consultants to NIST or ISO or HITRUST, they also don't have a solution provider team. So we have a team that implements security solutions such as log management solutions or antivirus solutions or identity and access management solutions. We actually have teams that do those for you. And so that, again, I think that differentiates us from quite a few of our competitors. Of course, I spoke to customer satisfaction and how we value relationships. It's really, I can't, that sounds like salesmanship, but it's really not. It's something that we hold near and dear to our heart. And it's why we have, it's how we got in, made a name for ourselves in the marketplace. You don't see Tevora do a lot of heavy marketing. We don't spend money on commercials. We've grown largely by word of mouth. And the reason why we've been able to use that approach is because of our effectiveness with our clients and customer satisfaction, and the way that we value relationship, I think, speaks to that. And then, of course, experience. I mentioned previously, you know, the breadth of experience that we have. So with that being said, that kind of wraps up the presentation. I want to note that if you go to Tevora.com, that we have a resources tab and a blog. We have a lot of resources. We've written articles on HITRUST, HIPAA, ISO, all of these topics. You can find additional resources on Tevora.com. So I'd encourage you to do that. But in the meantime, what we're going to do now is we're going to take some questions that we may have collected throughout this presentation, and I'm going to take a crack at answering those for you. If I can't answer those for you right now, what we'll do is we'll follow up with whomever asked the question and get those answers to you. So, Matt, if you want to go ahead and present a few of the questions that have been asked, go ahead, and we'll get to answering those.
Great, thanks, John. To begin with, why don't we start here? If an organization is HITRUST certified, can we assume that they are also HIPAA and HITECH compliant?
So that's a great question, and it's one that we get a lot. Historically, the answer is no. If you map the HIPAA security and privacy rule to the HITRUST control set that is required for certification, then we'll see a small delta of typically somewhere between 5 and 10 controls or HIPAA requirements under the security and privacy rule. So the answer is you'll be almost all the way there, but not quite all the way there. Now, my understanding is HITRUST is working on that. So the version 10 release may include the ability to address all of the HIPAA requirements. Not to get too into the HITRUST framework, but it is worth mentioning that the master control library for HITRUST does address all of the security rule requirements for HIPAA, but organizations aren't required to comply with the full HITRUST library. They're only given, in terms of certification, a subset of that library. And what I'm articulating here is that that subset typically does not cover all of or traditionally does not cover all of the HIPAA security rule requirements. So there's a small delta. What's the next question, Matt?
Okay, next. Although ISO is internationally recognized, vendor management teams do not accept it from an information security questionnaire perspective. How would you recommend that we push vendor management teams to accept the certification rather than complete hundreds of evaluations per year?
Yeah, vendor management is a very tricky topic because, you know, some organizations actually do accept ISO certification. So I think it's a little inaccurate to state that all vendors don't accept ISO 27001 certs. That's certainly not the case. We know that many vendors do. Tevora itself is ISO 27001 certified, for example. So we get some of those same questionnaires as a consultancy, of course. What I would say is the best practice is working with your legal team and your contracts team and try to pin down your vendors up front on what those standards are, what are available during kind of that contract negotiation phase. That's always the guidance that we give on third-party assurance and vendor management. After the fact, it's a little bit difficult because they can, depending on the contractual relationship, they can pretty much say which cert or standard they will or will not accept. Also, you know, talk to consultants about that stuff. You know, Tevora has an expert team in third-party vendor management. So we can tell by just the type of organization that you are, okay, these are the certs that you want. These are the ones that you can, if someone's asking for this cert, you can push back on it, and this is how I would push back on it. Ask us, the consultants, experts, because we live and breathe this stuff every day. If you're running into third-party management issues, I would encourage you to reach out to Tevora, and we'd be more than happy to have a call to talk about how we can help you. And that's not a sales call pitch. we may just help you pro bono, just give you some pointers to start building a relationship. So, I would encourage you to do that. But vendor management's tricky, and it can vary from industry to industry, also from continent to continent. The ISO 27001 cert goes a lot further from a vendor management perspective in Europe than it does in North America. However, in the healthcare world in North America, HITRUST is kind of seen as kind of a silver bullet of sorts in the healthcare vertical, whereas, of course, in Europe, there's not a lot of saturation with HITRUST, so most third parties won't accept it. That's the kind of knowledge that we can share with you from not only from a geographic perspective, but also a vertical perspective, and even type of organization or size of organization perspective. There are a lot of factors at play there. So I would say it's not something I can answer for you in 2 sentences, but certainly have a discussion with consultants to help guide you in terms of the right process to help you with dealing with that. But again, not an uncommon concern. We hear it pretty much every day. Third-party vendor management from a security and compliance perspective is a hot topic and not necessarily an easy one to tackle. All right, what's the next one?
Next, we received a couple similar questions, so I'm going to combine a couple of these here.
Okay.
What about the critical security controls framework? How does that fit in? And in addition to that, can you also talk about SOC 2?
Sure. So I'm not quite sure critical security controls framework, what they're referencing there. I don't know if they're referencing the NIST standard. And then, of course, that might be a SOC specific term. I'm jumbling my search right now, but I'll talk a little bit about SOC 2. And I almost threw SOC 2 in this presentation because it is one of the third-party certs that's heavily relied on, particularly in North America. But, again, it's kind of like ISO in terms of its control structure, but ISO, again, it's every third year full recert, whereas the SOC 2 is governed by the AICPA and required, and that cert is annual. So again, there's some key differences in terms of the frequency, but SOC is widely accepted. You see a lot of data centers performing SOC, again, also ISO 27001. A lot of other types of organizations leverage SOC. It's not uncommon for us to do a HITRUST and a SOC joint unified audit, or an ISO and a SOC. SOC is one of those that, because it's a relatively non-complex in terms of being certified and complex and compliant under, it's layered on top of a lot of frameworks, and that's where we get into that unified audit approach. So I would say, I don't think that that's exactly answering the question because I don't understand it directly, but that's what I would say about SOC and kind of how it plays globally, and also how it may overlap with some of these other certifications that we mentioned. Tevora, of course, we have a dedicated SOC team that's lights out. So if you have additional questions about SOC, we can put you in touch with them via email if you have questions, or we could certainly set up a call. Let's take the next question, Matt.
Okay, we had a couple questions come in about the slides. The slides will be presented following this presentation, so look for those in your inbox later this week. And so clarification on that.
Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to clarify, the last question was actually regarding the CIS critical security controls.
Oh, got it. So, the CIS critical security controls that's just another standard. I would almost compare that to NIST as a good list of controls. There are a lot of standards out there. I really wanted to hyper focus on NIST because, in my opinion, NIST is a little more universally recognized than CIS, but certainly NIST or CIS has a lot of credibility in the space, and we help clients with the CIS standards as well. So, in terms of how that plays with SOC, there is quite a bit of overlap. and it's not uncommon, again, for us to take a unified approach and combine those CIS standards with other standards such as the AIPA SOC framework. So I would say a little more common to see NIST than CIS in the marketplace, but certainly CIS is leveraged out there, and it's, if you feel that it's a better standard for your organization, certainly it has credibility. And that's, what I would encourage any organization to choose. I'm not trying to steer anybody from one standard to the next. That's really not our role as consultants. We want to guide our consultants on what we see in the marketplace and then let them make an informed opinion. If they ask us to guide us, we will, but we just want to put the information out there so organizations can make an informed opinion. What we always ask of our clients is take a look at both standards. So the CIS standards, take a look at the NIST 853 standards, compare the two, and think through which of these two standards makes the most sense for my organization. It may very well be that the CIS standards are more well suited to your environment than the 853. So there's a lot to that question, but at a high level, that's how I would answer it. In terms of providing slides, I'm going to go back to our contact information here. Reach out to Matt Fullerton. He's the guy that's been reading the questions. Send him an email, and he'll distribute the slides. I also want to emphasize that we put all of our content on our website, so you can catch a recording of this webinar on our website. But reach out to Matt for the slide deck directly. We're more than happy to distribute that. Really, we just want to help organizations with security and compliance. That's what we're all about. So go ahead and reach out to Matt, and we'll get that back to you. Any other questions, Matt? Let's just take a few more.
Okay, this next question here is, do you need both HITRUST certification and HIPAA attestation to fulfill HIPAA compliance or to demonstrate HIPAA compliance?
So really, to demonstrate HIPAA compliance, all you need is a HIPAA attestation. HITRUST is not required. The reason why organizations seek HITRUST is because, frankly, the HIPAA security rule is a little antiquated. It's been out over a decade. It's only about 45 or so requirements, not including the privacy rule. And, a decade is a long time. Technology's evolved a lot since then. Things like the cloud have become a thing, to kind of a joke there. But, HITRUST really goes way past HIPAA and gives organizations much more comfort that they're secure, or third parties much more comfort that your organization is secure, because everybody knows that HIPAA is kind of brief. There's only 45 requirements, and again, it's antiquated, whereas HITRUST is updating its requirements and library twice a year, sometimes more. So it's really much more up to date. It's much more comprehensive. Like I said, that our average HITRUST certification is anywhere between 300 to 400. Frankly, I love HITRUST. I wouldn't say I'm a HITRUST evangelist, but I see the impact that it has on organizations, and it's about much more than just HIPAA compliance. It's really about securing your environment and doing things like trying to, improving your cybersecurity posture. So again, for HIPAA compliance, you really only need to perform a HIPAA attestation. HITRUST is not required, but the reason why HITRUST has gained prominence in the marketplace is because, the healthcare industry has recognized that it needs to be more than the HIPAA security rule to be secure. So those are some of that's how I would compare and contrast HIPAA to HITRUST. What's the next one, Matt?
Which framework addresses cloud-based hostings, specifically public cloud environments?
So the Cloud Security Alliance have done a lot of cloud-specific work, but more comprehensive frameworks like HITRUST, for example, have addressed that as well. I don't think that there's there are some specific designations that you can get with the cloud service providers, and I'm not going to speak to each of the different vendors, but I would say if you're looking, I'll just name the big three: Google Cloud, Amazon, Azure. Certainly, if you do a little research, you'll note that there are some particular certifications that can be associated with each of those products. Again, Tevora, we're an expert in all of those environments. We're actually a pioneer in some of those environments. So we're very well suited to help organizations become compliant. I would say probably 75% of our clients now are in the cloud, so it's not even a groundbreaking thing like it was maybe 5 years ago. Pretty commonplace. But all of these certifications and standards are layered on top of the cloud environments. They're just, the controls are executed a little bit differently. So, for example, AWS has the dashboard that's used to manage the cloud. Well, when we are looking at access management and control, we look around the controls around that Amazon dashboard, for example. The controls haven't changed. It's just that you're applying them to the cloud environment. So, I would look at it more that way. All of these standards and certs apply to clouds, and they are interpreted to address cloud architecture specifically. But certainly, I would also add on top of that there are organizations out there like the Cloud Security Alliance that have been designed to specifically address cloud. And frankly, organizations like HITRUST and other standards have adopted some of that work that the Cloud Security Alliance has done. So, there's a lot to that question, but there's a lot of interdependent relationships as well. I think that's what I would say. That's a great question. Again, just to summarize, there are cloud-specific certs associated with the Amazon, Google, and Azure, and then of course all of these standards address cloud security and cloud architecture as well. And then again, third parties like Cloud Security Alliance that are specifically addressing cloud, but there are comprehensive frameworks that adequately address cloud security and compliance, including HITRUST and ISO. So, that's how I would answer that question. What's the next question, Matt?
Next, we have, can the NIST CSS certificate be achieved only by HITRUST? I think the question is, where can you receive this NIST certificate?
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's the only prominent third party. HITRUST is the only prominent third party issuing NIST certificates. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only way to demonstrate that you're NIST compliant. Tevora, we perform NIST attestations all the time. That is, and other consultancies do this as well. If you want to demonstrate that you're compliant with the 853, then we go through that same methodology where we perform a gap assessment and then the remediation and then the attestations. And we would provide you with a report and an attestation, a letter of attestation that demonstrates that you are compliant with NIST 853 or any of the other NIST standards that you might choose. Certainly it can also, it's pretty common in the marketplace to see a NIST attestation, but in terms of formal certification by a third party that's not a consultancy, that's the only one that I'm aware of, the only NIST certificate that I'm aware of that's distributed. What's the next question, Matt?
Next is a question about SOC for cyber, I believe called SOC 4. Is this gaining more traction? Is this better for US-based organizations instead of ISO?
Yeah, so, all of these frameworks take time. So SOC 4 is certainly relevant for cyber. I think it's relevant, but like any new framework, it just takes time to adopt, or the industry doesn't, the way that the cybersecurity and security industry works is for frameworks to really take hold, it takes several years. For example, HITRUST was around and adopted for several years, but it didn't really take, over a decade ago when HITRUST first announced its organization, but really HITRUST didn't really gain speed or gain prominence in the marketplace until about 5 years after that, I would say, ballpark. So don't quote me on that. I'm just kind of ballparking that. So I would say with any newer framework like that, it takes several years for the industry to kind of catch on or gravitate to it. But I do, because of the success of the other SOC certifications. I do expect that SOC 4 will gain some prominence. Now, it's kind of a crowded space, but because SOC is so well regarded in North America, I would expect to see more. But frankly, as one of we do a lot of volume in the SOC space, we don't see a lot of those yet. So, but 3 or 4 years from now, my guess would be we'll see a lot more of them. So again, like any new standard or certification, it just takes time for the marketplace to catch on, and perhaps that's what we'll see with SOC 4. All right, last question, Matt.
All right, last one. John, how common is it for companies to assess against multiple standards or frameworks?
Pretty common. I would say certainly any. Gosh, if I had to put a percentage on it, middle-sized and large businesses, maybe 75% will choose. They're required to not only be compliant with the federal regulations such as HIPAA, but also want to demonstrate ISO 27001 certification. Very, very common when we're talking about multiple standards or regulations or frameworks. We probably see that greater than 75%. So if you have if you're part of a good sized organization or company, you can expect that multiple standards or frameworks may be applicable to your organization. And that's really why I spoke to the unified audit approach in the presentation, because it's something that we see trending in the marketplace that the market is gravitating towards. That's what they want. We didn't just create that because we thought it was a neat idea. We created it because the marketplace demanded it. So, that's why I really focused on the unified audit approach. If you're a smaller startup, you may just choose one framework for the first couple of years. We see that as well. That's where we most commonly see a single standard. Or if you've got a really small budget and maybe you have to be PCI compliant, and that's the PCI data security standards, all that you require. Maybe that's the only standard that applies to your environment. We'll see that from time to time, but by and large, any organization, medium-sized or bigger, the odds are that you're going to want or you're going to be working with multiple standards and frameworks. So, all right. So that pretty much wraps up our presentation. Thanks for the great questions. If there are any other additional questions, feel free to reach out to Matt, and he'll channel those to the right experts. Again, Tevora.com is a great place to go to see some of our resources. Again, there's my email and Matt's email. If you want the presentation or have additional questions, we can certainly point you in the right direction. It's been a pleasure presenting to you all, and have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.